Well, hey, everybody, welcome back to the Preacher Boys podcast. April, thank you so much for joining me on today's episode.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
You're one of those people that's been on my list for a minute, and I always have these people that I'm like, I consume their content, I watch what they're putting out, but I don't feel like I have a good reason to reach out and connect. And then I see them announce a book, and I'm like, yeah, now's a good time. I know they're going to want to talk and promote this. So first and foremost, softball question. Why do you think a book on Christian nationalism is needed right now?
Well, I think, there's a lot of books on Christian nationalism already. But I think it's important because one, Christian nationalism is actively trying to take control of the country. And I don't think a lot of people realize that. And I think a lot of people in the church that espouse Christian nationalism also don't realize it. They because that's kind of the huge reason why I wrote my book, which is shameless plug, called Star Spangled Jesus: Leaving Christian Nationalism and Finding a True Faith, is because I was a Christian nationalist, but I didn't know that I was. And because so much of American evangelicalism, the faith is very intertwined with the political ideology, so much so that it can be hard to separate the two. And so I think the book's needed because there's a lot of books and just commentary on Christian nationalism from a very academic, factual, historical, like, this is what happens. These are the stats. Here's data. And that's all needed and good too. But my book and kind of why I speak on Christian nationalism is to kind of, pull back the curtain and see, like, how do people get sucked up into Christian nationalism, and what's the mindset, and what were things that made me change? And I mean, I was very, very, very in it. So, and now I'm not.
You weren't faking.
No. Yeah, I was not faking. Despite some people claim that I was never. You were never.
I don't know. I was reading some stuff. I don't know. It's possible. No, I resonate with your book a lot. We obviously grew up kind of different religiously, both fundamentalist in our own ways, but I grew up in the kind of independent fundamental Baptist world. But the part of your book that really hit me in the emotions last night was at the very, very end of the book, when you're talking about this idea that people think you just flip a switch. And it's easy to just switch sides. And now I'm going to be this like woke, liberal, fill in the blank with all the names and the smears that get thrown out. And it's such a long, harrowing journey to realize what you're in and going through the process of getting out and then like kind of course correcting. I was curious from a content creation standpoint, because this is something I think about myself. When did you know you were ready to put pen to paper and kind of, because a book has a sense of permanence to it, right? Like, I'm going to write this out. This is my thoughts on it. How did you know you were far enough in the journey to where you're not going to look back in 2 years and go, oh shoot, I was still in this lane, I wasn't quite done with my metamorphosis just yet.
Yeah. I mean, I would say I'm probably not done with my metamorphosis anyway. Like,
hopefully none of us are, I guess, right?
Yeah, I think we're all constantly changing. Or we should be, when we get new information, we should be willing to change our mind. But I would say it kind of just happened. It wasn't a conscious, like, oh, I am ready now. I had been on TikTok, was really how this all started in 2020 during the pandemic when we're all stuck at home. And before that, in 2016, I started talking on like my personal Facebook page, just really thinking out loud and just being like, hey, why are we all liking Trump, fellow Christians? Like, really? Is this our guy? Which I was a never Trumper. So they already didn't like me from that. But it got really frustrating and I felt alone because for whatever reason on Facebook, my friends, which was a lot of like my dad's ministry friends and people that I grew up with in the church, they, it was just really frustrating to have this conversation with them over and over and over again. Like, they weren't hearing me. And what they were saying did not make sense. Oh, Trump's God's chosen or whatever it was. And I just felt really alone. And Like I was constantly being gaslit. And, I literally would think, am I the crazy one? Am I the one getting this wrong? Because there wasn't like this huge deconstruction movement that I was aware of at that point. And so when I got on TikTok in 2020, I made one video. It was in May of that year. That was basically, it was to a trend at the time, but basically the message was when you're a Christian who doesn't like Trump, you get kicked out of the club. And it was like my most viral video yet. It was my first one to get almost 1 million views. And it was full of like 1,000+ comments of people being like, oh my gosh, I thought I was the only one. And that was kind of when I started to feel this boldness because I knew, oh no, it's not me. I'm not the crazy one. Like my instincts and what I'm feeling inside are valid. And so that kind of gave me the courage to keep posting about stuff. And I typically did it in a humorous way because humor is how I cope, so I don't cry. And so then I did that for several years, and then I got the opportunity someone asked me to write a book. And my spouse Beecher was always like, you have the craziest story. Like people don't believe your background. You should write a book. And I was like, I don't know. But yeah, I think having those few years kind of deconstructing out loud on TikTok or on the internet gave me the courage of like, well, the internet's forever. Might as well put it in a book that's also forever.
I kind of like that approach too. Like even starting this show, I started 4.5 years ago, was still evangelical light, I would say, when I started the show. And, sometimes I look back at old things I said and cringe even. And I don't think there's anything atrocious, but like I look back and just go like, I wouldn't say that now, or things have changed. But I kind of like that I have this open diary with the world, the same way you do with like your TikTok videos and your Facebook posts. You share some of those really interesting ones from way back when in the book. But I like that rather than kind of going to seclusion and just asking the questions yourself, like having that public dialogue is really neat. Yeah, Trump was a trip, and I don't want to do like a whole anti-Trump episode, but as easy as that would be for me to do. But he was a turning point for a lot of people. Like, I've talked to Dr. Laura Anderson and, the deconstruction and all the people that have experienced this crisis of faith, seeing churches support a candidate who seems to be diametrically opposed to everything Christian religion stands for.
Yeah.
And then realizing, oh, but this is the representation of everything that evangelicalism stands for. Like this is what they want. For you, what did the Trump election cycle really mean for you? And why do you think you saw these glaring, like obvious flaws that religious leaders who've been studying the Bible allegedly for 30, 40 years couldn't see?
I ask myself that question a lot because I'm like, it's so obvious. I don't understand. I mean, I do think being a little younger than like, your Franklin Grahams of the world, they have their livelihood on the line if they were to, about face and completely be like, nah, we're going to vote for the Democrat. But I also just think like it is so ingrained. You have to be willing to question everything. I mean, I went through an existential crisis, and they call it a crisis for a reason. It's not fun. No one enjoys it. Bawling on the floor, begging God, be like, is any of it true? Like it's not a fun experience. So you have to be willing to go through that. And I just think a lot of people, it's easier to just go with the status quo. For me, my biggest thing with Trump was that I remember when evangelicals were canceling Bill Clinton for, what he did with Monica Lewinsky. And, they were saying because he wasn't faithful to his wife, he's no longer fit to be president. Because if he would lie to his wife, he's going to lie to the American people. And we are the party of morals and righteousness, and Democrats are not. And when you see Trump, who is not righteous by evangelical standards and like literally can't answer a single faith question where he doesn't bring up himself, or he literally said he's never asked God for forgiveness. I thought for sure when he said that in 2015, that was it. I'm like, oh, they got to know now. He can't even answer a basic like evangelical 101. Like even your most nominal Christian can answer that question. And that was just like, oh, okay. So we're just hypocrites, and I think and then I realized, oh, we've always been hypocrites, but it was just blatantly obvious that I couldn't ignore it anymore. And I mean, I've had problems for sure, and I've definitely been on the wrong side of things, and I have caused harm with my beliefs. But I always have had this integrity that I'm going to do what I believe is right. And so I suddenly was just met with this. I was at this two roads at a fork in the road and trying to decide, okay, I can either keep going with where I've been going, but no, like now I know I'm a hypocrite, or I can go down this other path that is really scary, but I just feel like that's the right thing to do. And that's what I did.
I mentioned Trump because for me, not to say Trump was the reason I left my faith, but Trump was somebody where I was literally in India working with an orphanage for a missions organization. And then I'm hearing the rhetoric about Muslims. I'm hearing, I'm someone who's cared about the issues of sexual abuse in churches for a really long time. And so when the tapes came out and I saw pastors support him, I was like, I'm currently ministering in an area that the people who are supporting wouldn't really care if it got blown off the face of the map. I'm caring about sexual assault victims that these pastors already showed me they didn't care about, but now they're supporting a candidate who's bragging about it in a recording. For me, it was rocket fuel on my kind of deconstruction, where it was like, okay, again, he's embodying the values of evangelicals at this point. He's definitely not embodying the values that I hold in the religion that I was experiencing separately. And, that's when the paths kind of start splitting directions. I'm kind of curious for you, like, as this work is happening and as you're kind of having the wallpaper peel or the blinders come off and you're seeing all of this, like, how did you navigate that in a way where you maintain some sanity? Like, because it's such a messy, and I ask that from experience, like, it's a really messy journey. And it feels like your community kind of evaporates instantly because you can't ask anybody about this stuff. Like, who was your community and how did you navigate this? And looking back, how do you wish you would have caused you a little less, harm?
I would say the early Trump years of his presidency, I had my spouse pretty much, and I'm very fortunate that we've been on the same page on things. So we had each other when we didn't have.
Was that
people.
in exact sync, or was there like a gap where it's like you'd go a little further and then it was like this strain and then you'd catch up? Or was it like we're kind of in tandem the whole way?
I would say we always agreed on the Trump issue. We were both never Trumpers, to the dismay of many family members. But like theologically, whole deconstruction, I would say, it was kind of like this, there were some issues I pulled Beecher along. There were some issues Beecher pulled me along. But for the most part, like, there was no judgment though, because we were both deconstructing at the same time and having our own kind of, oh my gosh, what's happening moment. But just, different topics were, at different times. So we were both very fortunate to have that with each other, because I know plenty of people that, one person deconstructs and the other person is like digs in their heels or goes even more fundamentalist. And my heart goes out to that, because that's got to be really, really hard. But I honestly, being on TikTok and just seeing other people start speaking out on the same thing, and there was like this kind of deconstruction community in like 2020, 2021 on TikTok is where I was, but it was everywhere. And it's not like Trump didn't start deconstructing or deconstruction. Like, that's been a thing for a long time. But I do think Trump in 2020, especially when everyone was stuck at home with COVID, in the pandemic and quarantine, like, I think a lot of us didn't have much else to do but think. And we're like, oh, well, I don't have time. I might as well just completely reevaluate everything I've ever believed. Did I answer your question? I can't remember if I
Like,
Oh, fair enough.
yeah. I mean, I was just curious, like, really like looking back, because like I look at it and I felt so lonely for a
Yeah.
long time, and I was lucky too. I had a spouse that we've always respected each other's ability to think. So, and I've always said, like, I think forming relationships over how you address issues is more important than where you stand on these issues. Like, if I'm sitting there across from my wife and she goes, you know, oh, I think this now about the Bible, or I think this about politics, and I just go like, let me show you. You know, it's like, instead of understanding and knowing, well, she's wrestled with this too, you know, and so I was lucky with that, but I feel like where I was unlucky is that I feel like a lot of my friend group, or like people that were like mentors, especially mentors, it was like, oh, bye. Like, we're gone, you know? And so I guess looking back, or like if someone's saying, hey, now I'm a little late to the party, it's 2024, I'm reading your book and I want to talk about it. Like, how do they even do that in a way that's not going to be just like, oh, I cut off everybody, I'm starting from scratch, I don't even know how to make friends at 30, you know, going through this process?
I mean, it's hard, and everyone's going to be different. It depends on, you know, the people in your life. I will say the things that have worked for me when I've had conversations with people that were still in that world was for me to ask them questions that I know they don't have good answers to. And that's what worked on on me, like before I fully deconstructed, like people that had a different perspective that were asking me to explain my own beliefs or like my own political ideology. Like, well, how does a pro-life position make sense, you know, when it comes to abortion, but then at the same time you're for the death penalty? Like, how does that make sense? Or, you know, you're against any sort of gun reform, and, you know, children keep getting shot in schools. Like, where should we not be pro-life on that? You know, like it was more just like poking little holes in arguments, and it can be a very long, tedious process because people don't change overnight. It takes a lot of time. The thing that I found encouraging is, I mean, people deconstruct and they reevaluate their faith and they'll land in all sorts of places. For me, I was really trying to keep my faith. Like, I love Jesus, and I felt I didn't want to lose that in all of this. And the one thing that kind of kept me sane in it all, when I'd see like, oh my gosh, evangelicals just saying awful things and, you know, being against immigrants and like all the things that Jesus actually talks about, like those are the people we should be helping. I literally would read the Gospels and the red letters and what Jesus said. And that, honestly, that was what kept me from being like full on gaslit. Because I'm like, okay, y'all are saying this, but that is literally the antithesis of what Jesus is teaching here in the Sermon on the Mount. And that kind of kept me grounded in the early days.
What's your take on, because I feel like there's, again, I resonate so much with you in this, like, it was like a wrestling match with yourself where it's like, what do I think about this? Where is this? And I think the critics of deconstruction have that mentality of like, it's a switch. Like, oh, they wanted to sin. I forget. I just watched a clip the other day and it was like, the reason people deconstruct is that they want to sin, you know? And like, that's like the go-to. Sex. Yeah, right.
But there's another category, and that category is the person that wants to do a certain type of sin. And this is kind of what we see in the Joshua Harris. Hey, I want to affirm LGBTQ. Or someone who is same-sex attracted and says, hey, look, I just really can't live, sexually abstinent. So I am going to participate in this. I am choosing this over God. But the purpose for the deconstruction is to allow them to go, well, I'm not going to just live in rebellion every day. I need to find a way that my reason can allow me to live this way.
That is not most people I've talked to. Like, most people are the people that were the most bought in Christians. They were serving in every ministry. Like, they read their Bibles. Like, they were into this stuff. But I also do see a swath of people who I see jumping ship in the evangelical world, and they're seeing the issues, but then they're jumping headfirst into just another movement, whether it's political, religious, without second thought. And they're kind of go through this cycle of like jumping from one toxic pool to the next. Do you think it's important to or I guess I'm asking, is it okay to be in a purgatory between, oh, I know what I think about this, and like, oh, now I believe the opposite of that? Is it okay to rest in this purgatory? And like, should you put a time limit on that to figure out like, where do I stand on, this policy or this religious, belief, or if I'm religious at all?
Yeah, no, totally. I think when you grow up evangelical or fundamentalist in any way, you're not only taught beliefs, but you're taught black and white thinking. Like as you said earlier, you are taught that what you believe and how you think is almost more important than how you behave. Like they can forgive a slew of transgressions as long as that person is on the right side of beliefs. And so I think when you initially start deconstructing, that doesn't just go away. Like the need to know, the need to have a position on everything, because it's got to be black and white. And so I think one of the more important things to deconstruct first is the need to know, and like just learning to be okay with not knowing, because really at the end of the day, regardless of what our beliefs are, nobody knows. We don't know like what happens when we die. We don't
Someone
know.
right now is like, no, I do. someone listening is thinking it right now.
Right. Like we can believe, we could say, I think this happens when we die, but that's not knowing. And the church has convinced us that belief is knowing. But belief is faith. Like that's where faith comes in. And we were taught like you have to know beyond a shadow of a doubt. But that's actually the opposite of faith, because faith is found in uncertainty and being like, I believe this, even though I don't know, but this is where my faith comes in, as opposed to, which is, it's like the cognitive dissonance, because we're taught like faith without, you believe things without seeing it and da-da-da. But then at the same time, like, but we know, like, but we don't, nobody knows. And I think that was one of the hardest things for me to let go of, because initially I wanted to I was researching what are my beliefs on hell? What do I believe about creation?
Like moving systematically through
right,
everything.
I have to have a position. Yeah, and I've and initially I did that, and and I've landed on some places, but I've also now, because I was so wrong before, I'm like, there's a good chance I'm going to be wrong again, because I don't know. I'm one human being on this floating rock in the universe. Like I can do all the studying in all of the world and I still won't know.
Yeah.
So I'm like, it's okay. It's okay to not know.
Yeah. Yeah. What role, and if this is too personal, you don't have to answer, but I'm curious, like what role spirituality plays for you now? Because like I mentioned this on a past episode, like I find myself in a place like I struggle to wake up and default into it is the Christian theology, like even on a base level. Like I would say I'm like, depending on the day, I lean almost atheistic in most of these areas, but I like to believe there's some reason for all of this. There's got to be something. But I listen to people who I deeply respect, who still hold to faith. It is valuable to them. Spirituality is a part of their life. And I feel a sense of envy of having that kind of esoteric faith in something. But I can't generate that. And it's not something you can just be like, oh, ta-da, it's back to normal. Like, what does spirituality mean to you currently? And how does that look different? I know that's a big question. How does it look different than what it was before? Because it's not really dogma now. It's more of like a connection, a sense of something, a moral, like what does it look like for you now?
One of the biggest differences is before I always had pressure on myself, on my spiritual life, and I was never good enough. I never prayed long enough. I never read my Bible enough. Like I would always, when I would pray, pretty much half of the time praying would be me asking God for forgiveness for not praying more. Because, you just always feel like you're not doing enough. And there was just this pressure to be that good Christian, but it was never enough unless you were like praying nonstop 24/7 and doing all the things. And now I've taken the pressure off, because I just like, that's such a dogmatic works based idea of spirituality that I don't think is healthy. Like if I'm adding shame for not doing the thing that's supposed to get rid of my shame, like that's counterproductive. And so now, I mean, by most people's standards of spiritual practice, they'd be like, you don't have a spiritual practice. But I feel like God, like I do believe in God and the divine, is everywhere. And I'm finding the beauty of, a creator or just a higher being in everyday human interactions, like spending time with my kids and seeing like wonder. Like I think I'm practicing wonder more and, like with nature and just like I've got a bird feeder. I'm obsessed with watching these birds. I will watch them for a long time. Like it's like my favorite thing. I have full conversations about the birds. But it just makes me have this appreciation of my role on this planet and like me and this bird, or a bee, or I know I'm sounding like new age, but like we all have a place on this earth and our roles are different, but they're not any more or less important, like in the ecosystem of the world. And so I'm just trying to like appreciate being in the moment. As far as like belief wise, spiritually, I still pray to Jesus. And I grew up Pentecostal. And so I feel like I have spiritual experiences that I cannot explain in any way whatsoever. And that's kind of kept me like, I believe something's out there. And the language that I've always used is Jesus. And I've felt this closeness to the spiritual being of Jesus. And so that's my language for that. That's why I still love Jesus. But I also believe that same spirit is probably the same one that a Muslim would call Allah, or like I guess it's more like a universal Christ would be where I'd fall, and like just finding God in everyone, and that it's not like this exclusive, like we're the only people that have access to God. I think everybody has access to God. So yeah, I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, no, it does. It does. I'm always curious, and it's a selfish question for me because I feel like I'm feeling out where everybody is, and I feel very similar. Like I feel, and I was talking to somebody recently, and it was Krista Brown when I interviewed her, and we were talking about our experiences, religious experiences, and both of us were talking about like reconnecting with nature was like. And it sounds new agey, and I'm like the first one to make fun of people for new agey stuff. One of my closest friends loves crystals and loves all that stuff, and I like make fun of it all the time in a very loving way. But then I'll be sitting there, I'm like, yeah, for me, I just like to go out and listen to the wind through the trees, and she's like, that's new agey too. Okay, so but I'm always curious people's expressions, and I'm always fascinated by what that looks like for people, because I think it's a statement we throw out all the time, is like, don't neglect your spiritual side. Like you have your mental health, your physical health, and you have the spiritual health. And I always am like, but is that important? Is it not? Mm-hmm. Do I just say that because I grew up religious? Like it's so hard to strip apart. Like you mentioned growing up Pentecostal, it's like you have experiences you can't explain that make sense in that framework. But then your brain is going to like, do I think that because I grew up that way? Do I think that because that's what it is? Like, is it, I was taught to understand it that way? Is it because it truly is something different and they would call it something else? It's like you can go down all these rabbit holes. And I think some of that is the fun of it, is like you kind of get to trace those lines for yourself. But yeah,
you get to actually choose your beliefs as opposed to being spoon-fed your beliefs when you're raised with something like this. It's like, no, I can choose what I want. But I am hesitant, like on my own channel. And even in the book, I talk about it some in the book, but I don't want to tell people what to believe, or, and I'm even hesitant to say my personal beliefs because I don't think that matters. Like that's an intangible. It's not what matters. Far more is our actions, what we're actually doing. Are we making this world a better place? Are we helping our communities? Are we loving our neighbor? That to me means way more than whether I believe all of the exact right things.
Yeah. Yeah. And I got that sense from your book, which is great, by the way. I haven't said that yet, but it really, really great. And I enjoyed it because I consume a lot of very heavy content for the show. This is one of my lighter episodes because we're not talking about abuse. So I'm consuming a lot of heavy content, even the stuff that I've read on the subject of Christian nationalism, like reading Jesus and John Wayne is a heavy, heavy, heavy book. There's a lot of
Yeah.
like just raw fact there. And reading yours has that blend of humor to make it feel palatable and digestible. And I can sit down and binge read through the book and be like, this is great. I love this. It's good. But I get the sense through the book that you are asking questions through the book and not just prescribing, here's your voter guide for 2024.
Yeah.
Like, vote for like you mentioned in your book, like how pastors be like, it doesn't matter who you vote for, just vote for the person that has all these checkpoints. It's like,
Yeah.
that's the Republican, I didn't feel you did that with like, here, Kamala Harris right here. Like, this is why you need to vote for her. Or here's Bernie Sanders. Here's why. Or here's Trump. Here's why. It was like, ask yourself these questions and establish these values. And I'm curious, like going into, we happen to be very close to an election period that could have some interesting results. You mentioned your book over and over again, like the difficulty of, and you mentioned in this episode, like shifting someone's perspective and getting people to look at things a different way. We all have this black and white default fundamentalist thinking that we hold on to. What is the message you would hope that everybody would take to heart going into this election cycle? Because I feel like we can get really lost in the weeds on vaccines and, my candidate can beat up your candidate and abortion registration. Like,
Yeah.
there is so many things like that where it's like, I feel like the thing I've really been pushing for is like, what are your values? Like, what are the things you actually value and vote accordingly? Like, what are you hoping people will come to think about, or at least consciously think about stepping into the booth in November?
Yeah. Well, I'm hoping my book will reach two different types of people and that it will affect them in different ways. The first group, if they read my book, I don't know if they will, but people that are maybe more moderate, conservative leaning, that might be a little bit Christian nationalist and may not realize it, that they will read my book, see some flaws maybe in their own thinking through my own story, and know like it's okay to change your mind. It's okay to re-examine things, and you will be okay. You will find your way, and like almost give someone permission that your world's not going to end. It might be hard for a while, but I did it, and you can do it. Like anyone can change, sort of scenario. But then also like, I just want people to question who they're getting information from too. Figure out if you're only getting information from one type of source or one type of news source.
I have written down your URL from the book.
Oh yeah.
www.america-freedom-eagle-patriot-news-rapture-Jesus-loves-you russianbot.info. And I wrote it down because that was one of my favorite parts of the book, because I always, for like years, I've always joked with my wife. I'm like, every website that these certain family members or friends said to us is like https health-gov- and it's like 30 characters just like that. And so I cackled when I read that in the book. I thought that was great.
Oh, good.
But
I'm glad.
anyway,
Yeah, you gotta laugh.
I sorry to interrupt your answer, but I thought it was funny right when you said, where are we getting our news from? And I looked over and saw that URL in my notes.
Yeah.
But
yeah, well, I guess like for that group, question where like just question any news source and then check it from multiple places. If something is like if you read something and you feel outraged by it, fact check that before you act on that outrage, and from several different sources. And there might be some truth to it, but usually there's something in the middle. And then the other group that hopefully my story would help would be just like really progressive people that almost have that in some ways also have a black and white thinking and are just very dogmatic in that all MAGA supporters are evil, or all Christian nationalists are just they just hate you. And there's some validity to that, and I'm sure there are people on that side that really are that bad. But just to remind people that we are all human at the end of the day. And I believe most people, especially, people that are in the church that believe they're good, that want to be good from a religious standpoint, they are working from a perspective where they actually think they're doing the right thing. That doesn't negate harm and, their the problematic things that they say and do. That doesn't take away from that. But to just point fingers and call these people pure evil, they're going to take that and use that as a persecution badge, and that's just going to fuel them even more, and make them more dogmatic. When really we just need to, really just having conversations with people that think differently than you, and just to humanize, both sides need to humanize each other, which I know it's hard. It's so hard when people are being so nasty and they're actively taking rights away from minority groups. It's so hard to not be angry. And there's nothing wrong with being angry. But I also just, it's just hard. It's a really hard belief system to break out of, because you're in an echo chamber. Your entire community is that. And I actually have a lot of pity for people that are still in this really in-depth Christian nationalism, because it's an exhausting way to live, where you're second guessing everything that you do. You're looking at, and I really think a lot of the hate that they have towards queer people is almost a very deeply rooted envy, because they see people living out who they are with freedom, like actual freedom, and they're white knuckling their faith and, feeling shame over seeing a woman in a bikini on a beach. It's not a fun place to be. That does not take away from the fact that they are actively causing harm. I want to be clear about that. You can call that out. But there just needs to be a better understanding of where people are coming from. And it's usually not because they're pure evil.
Right. And there's respect for the intent of the person. Because that's the thing I think gets lost. And I have followers of my content because my show deals with issues in the church. So there's a lot of people who have left the church, and rightfully so, dislike the church and have major issues.
Fair, same.
Yeah, totally fair. And I know your audience is going to be a lot of that as well. And I have people that follow that are Christians that are Trump support. I literally was just talking with a very close friend who's been on the show who supports Trump, and but their intention is not oh, I want to they're not seeing the things that I'm seeing, right. And I'm not saying that in a way of well, my eyes are open and I'm unplugged from the matrix and I can see everything they can't. But I know people who truly believe this is going to be best for our economy, which is going to help everybody. The people that are voting pro-life that,
really believe they're saving babies.
Right. If you're voting and you're stepping in a ballot box and you're saying, I'm saving the lives of human babies, that's a very moral thing to think. But you also need to look at the data and go, okay, during which political cycle are there more abortions? If that's the issue you're concerned with, what resources actually help with unplanned pregnancies? Same thing with even, and I want to talk about this in a second, but even with all of the hysteria around the trans issues, the rhetoric they're hearing is children are under attack, and people that are scared of children being under attack, that's a good thing. But look at the data. That's not what's happening. That's not the reality of this situation. So I think in the conversation, it's not winning the war in every conversation. It's again, asking the questions. My go-to questions almost always are, have you ever talked to X person? When someone tells me Muslims think this, have you ever met a Muslim person? Someone says the gays are doing this. Have you ever met a gay person? The trans people are doing this. Have you ever talked to a trans person in your life? And the answer is almost always no. I have no idea. I heard someone say this on a news channel. For some of these pressing issues, I mentioned, you mentioned your book, all the anti-trans legislation, that 558 anti-trans bills across the United States in the first 6 months of 2023 versus 19 in 2019. There's a lot of hysteria whipping up things that are actively harming large swaths of people.
Right.
What's the best way to engage in those fights without like you said, giving people a persecution badge, pushing them further and further into their bunkers, like the well-intentioned grandmother that with the right questions could find her way out, like not shoving her deeper and deeper into, the Q conspiracy hole.
Yeah. I mean, just asking questions, asking them like, well, what should someone do if they have gender dysphoria? What should someone
get
do?
Saved.
Right,
April,
right.
Get saved.
Right. And then you say like, well, there are Christian trans people that tried praying, like what, and God didn't answer their prayer. Like what would you say that they do if the alternative is they really would want to kill themselves? Like, would you, and also like just giving, it can be, it's so hard because it depends on the person. There's some people that will not hear it, that, they are set in their ways. They don't want to hear it. But I think most people who want to be good, they're not, I don't think they would demonize a trans person in person, like in the flesh.
Right. It's easy on Facebook to go.
Right. You have all these keyboard warriors. But, also that's not fair you don't want just trans people going up to really bigoted people and being like, look, I'm human. And like, that's too much for them. Like it's such a hard, it's just hard. But I do think just bringing another perspective, like, did you hear that the abortion rate actually went up nationwide since Roe v. Wade was overturned? And then they probably haven't. They're not announcing that stat on Fox News, or just like, did you know, like countries that have really comprehensive sex education and that have free access to birth control, but they have abortion legal, like their abortion rates are actually really, really low. Like those are the ones that have the lowest rates, and just kind of little by little, because most people, if you come in swinging, they, it just makes them double down. I mean, I was the same way. I will say though, there were times where people came in swinging for me, and even though I doubled down,
later
it did make me like, it was something that stuck. Yeah, it stuck with me over time, and that happening enough over and over and over again eventually made me second guess it. But there's just so much demonization of people right now that it's hard. It's hard
not to go on the defense when especially when you know these people. Like that's the thing now is like when you're in the church, it's like my Christian friends, they feel attacked over this. I'm going to band with them. And now my friend group is so diverse where it's like, I have like 2 to 4 really close friends. And then I feel like I've got this big community of people that I just know through, and I'm sure you feel the same way with content. It's like, I know all these people in all these different states with all these different experiences and different, interactions with the world. And it's like, nothing's abstract to me now. Like when someone says this thing about, the trans issue, it's like I'm rolling through my mind of like, well, I know these trans people in person. Like, how would I feel if this person said that about them? Or when it comes to issues of fill in the blank, whatever it is, abortion. Yeah. It's like, well, I know people that have, it's like this rhetoric is not just a stat. It's like, this is a name and a face to it. And I say that to say, I think one of the things you mentioned that if I can add another angle to it, is like, I think asking the questions to those people that aren't going to budge, that aren't going to change, I think asking the questions is still good for people who are still one cheek in the pew, that are like still questioning themselves. Because I think people don't realize how horrific the answers to those questions are until they hear their pastor or their parents or their siblings actually say it. Like the question you just posed, like, would you rather someone be dead or trans or gay? And it's like, I've heard people in churches say, I'd rather my kid be dead than gay. And it's like, to hear that as someone who's questioning the morality of the world that they're in or the religious denomination they're in, like that answer gives you a lot of perspective into what you're actually in. Like beneath the Jesus loves you and the hymns and the pews, like there's other layers to this that are way more sinister. And I think most people don't dig deep enough to hear those kind of heavier and crueler responses.
Yeah, I think another angle too, kind of to piggyback off what you're saying, is for people that are still in it to say, well, did you hear this pastor that said this, or that they want to take, that an end goal of like Project 2025 is that they want to get rid of contraception. And, like there are people that actually are believing these things. There are Christian nationalist men right now calling to repeal the 19th and taking the women's right away to vote. And, saying like, did you know, like people on your side are calling for this? Like, do you agree with that? And I would think most people would say, no, I don't agree with that. And then you just say, well, like that's an end goal. That's the scary thing, and why a lot of people are trying to push back against Christian nationalism and all this stuff. And then, you can always bring up theological points too of, speak their language, which, dies hard when you grow up in it. So it comes pretty naturally anyway. But, it's like, when you are outwardly supporting Trump, who says these really awful things about all these people, like that's a really bad witness for Christianity. And if you're wanting people to be Christian, like you don't want to offend them, like some people might care about that, but
yeah, I would hope, there'd be some
they
that
claim that they do. So,
Right.
Almost like kind of push them to actually follow through.
Yeah. I know we've got a few minutes left. I'm curious on the Project 2025 topic. It's something that I have dipped my toe into. I've read a lot, like Tia Levings has written extensively on it. I've read her takes on it. I've seen Tim Whitaker with New Evangelicals, which you've done many episodes with him. I've seen him talk about it. And my gut instinct when I first started hearing about it was like, this is the big bad boogeyman. It's not something that's legitimate. It's like, it's blown out of proportion. And now I'm going, more and more things are coming out, more and more people that are, the people that actually wrote the documents, like coming out more publicly. Like, it seems like it's not just a boogeyman. It seems like there's actually some things there that are really concerning. Do you think it's more effective to call out the plan as a whole, or kind of like piece it apart, like the way we've been talking about, where it's like, there's this big blueprint here that essentially is a Christian nationalist wet dream. It's like, do we fight that head on? Or is it like, hey, we need to pick this apart piece by piece and just get people to like not vote in this direction?
Yeah. I mean, I still think a good chunk of Americans don't understand what Project 2025 is. So probably pinpointing specific things about the document, which is huge. I have not read all 900.
Well, it's like a literal
pages.
book. I saw a picture of it. Oh, shoot. It's an encyclopedia of like really nasty stuff.
I mean, I think both work. I think you need both in tandem to call out Project 2025. But now you have Trump and a lot of people in his campaign denying any association with it, which is just wrong. But they're denying.
And then the author is like recorded like, yeah, I still talk to Trump about it all the time. He loves it, So it's like
there's pictures of him. He spoke at the Heritage Foundation. Yeah, it's like you clearly knew. But even regardless, if you look at his Agenda 47, a lot of the things in that are very similar to what was in Project 2025. So just even if you just take the name out of it, there is a huge group of people within Republican Party right now that want to heavily limit access to contraceptive, want to ban IVF, want to consider the Alabama Supreme Court ruled this past year too that a frozen embryo is a child, which is maddening. And then in Texas, you have bounty laws in place where people can report on someone who got an abortion, even if it was out of state and legally in another state. You can tattletale on them and get rewarded $10,000, like sue them for $10,000. So you have people that are wanting to criminalize women who get abortions. You have people that want to take away the women's right to vote. And yes, a lot of this is fringe, but these people in the fringes have power. A lot of them are elected officials. They have Trump's ear. And here's the thing. I think Trump, at the end of the day, he just wants to be in power. I really don't think he cares what his policies are, as long as he's the one in control of them. But the scary thing is the people behind him, the people that put together Project 2025, a lot of his advisors, a lot of the evangelical advisors that he have, they're going to be pulling the strings behind him, saying, like, if you want to keep your supporters, you've got to do these things. And they're getting more and more extreme with it. And so I think, just talking about the specifics of real world impact too. Like, there was a law in Tennessee. I think it might have been passed now. When I live in Kentucky now, but we were living in Tennessee a couple years ago, and there was this anti-drag bill that was passed, and then it got appealed, and I think it was off for a while. It might be back. But basically, in the law, it was so vague that it said that anyone that was quote unquote cross-dressing in public could be fined or arrested. Basically, was what this was, which is different than drag. Like, those are two different things. My spouse is non-binary and sometimes wears feminine, like, women's clothes. And like, we literally had to have a conversation. Like, are we going to be safe here if this law goes into effect and you have a cop that's, really anti-trans and sees you walking down the street and it's like, here's my chance. Like, this is impacting everyday people that I don't think most people would look at my spouse and be like, yeah, you need to be arrested just for clothes, for what someone's wearing. Like, what are we doing? And, and I think too, pointing out a lot of people on the conservative side and Christian nationalists, they regularly tout the importance of freedom. They love their freedom. I was just about to say,
the constitutionalists going after freedom of expression is gold.
Exactly. And I think, pointing out that cognitive dissonance of like, I totally admire that you are for freedom and I'm for freedom too. But
yes. The intent is good, right? But it's so misdirected. Yeah.
Yeah. And then but don't you think, like, isn't taking freedom away from someone, like, isn't that un-American at its very core?
Yeah.
Just like framing questions in a way that's not attacking, which it takes a lot of patience. I know that, but and everyone's different. Maybe someone does need to be like, hey, you're being a bigot right now and you need to stop it. And maybe that's enough. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. And like I said, there's so many things that are based on misrepresentations of what happens. There's laws that blanket things that are so, and to be honest, like, I've taken a bit of a break from politics in the last year as far as like how much I consume. I used to be so, like, I would put on C-SPAN in the background as I'm like doing stuff. Like, I love that world, but it's, as I focus on other things, I've had to step back, but I still feel like even by checking into some stuff, I feel more informed than the average person I see spouting stuff on Facebook. And it's like the anti-abortion laws. It's like, okay, well, I know people who've had miscarriages that needed DNC that under the law that you're pushing for on your Facebook page would make, and for the friend this happened with, they literally couldn't have it performed at this hospital because the hospital had religious exemptions against performing quote unquote abortions. Yeah. And so it's like, people don't dig deeper than just the talking point, and they're voting with this, like, again, maybe a good intent, but it's so misdirected and so like under informed for lack of
that is a lot of it too. Is there's a lot of misinformation and sensationalized idea, fear mongering on that side too. And I think people they're reacting with what they know. But a lot of what they know either just isn't true or is just heavily misdirected.
Right. Yeah. Well, I can't believe an hour's gone already. But I'm curious. I know in the beginning I mentioned, like, why do you think this book is important? I'm curious for someone who's listening right now, wherever they might be on the spectrum. And I know for a fact there's some people listening that are Trump supporters, and there's some people that are like never Trumpers. I know there's people who are Republican, Democrat, like pretty broad variety of people listening. Like, if you could give like 1 to 2 sentences elevator pitch of like, hey, grab a copy of my book right now, wherever you're at. This is what I hope you get from it.
Yeah. So I think I just got my book in the mail.
I have a digital copy. I was going to hold up I've got
PDF. the whole thing
Beautiful.
right here. So Star Spangled Jesus. It's flipped, but that's okay. My elevator pitch is that I tell a lot of funny stories, anecdotal stories of my time in Christian nationalism, including singing on the Jim Bakker Show, an original song called America Say Jesus, campaigning for Mitt Romney, working at 700 Club, Pat Robertson. It was very, very, very in it. And so if you just want to peek behind the scenes of either the machine that you are supporting, if you are on the right side of things, politically, or if you just want to have a better understanding of why someone could be a Christian nationalist, then it's just kind of like inside my mind of when I was in it. So it can hopefully give people just a better understanding of where people are coming from, but also you can see the slow change. Like you can see the things that helped me change, and hopefully it can help other people change or help others change, if that makes sense.
Love that. Yeah, people that don't like the progressive leaning you have now can just read about your past history and just pretend that's where it stops. They just shut the book, like Jim Bakker Show, and that's a wrap. We're done.
But you actually love parts of the story.
Depending how you approach it, you can find something to love. Well, thank you so much for doing this. I hope it's not the last time we talk. You're one of those people, like I said, I've been watching for a long time, and I've been wanting to chat for a long time, and the book gave me a great reason to. And I've loved getting to know you through the book a little bit more, so it adds some more depth to all your content and posts that I read. So thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. We'll definitely have to chat again sometime.